This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. Is austerity the way to go to get us out of the fiscal crisis? One of the world's leading economists says no, that austerity is a lose-lose proposition right now. And with the deadline just 1 month away, a historian tells us that the income tax was an idea supported by the little people and Donald Duck. And Bill Press talks with a Catholic journalist and priest who says the odds are against an American being elected pope. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Adam Posen is one of the world's leading economists and, until recently, the only American to serve on the British equivalent of the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank. He tells us why austerity is not the answer to our fiscal woes and that deficit reduction should wait until economic times are better. Joining us today on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats, Adam Posen is president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, the world's leading independent think tank on economics and globalization. He is one of the world's foremost experts on fiscal and monetary policy, financial crises, and the economies of Europe, Japan, and the United States. And we are honored to have him as a guest. Adam Posen, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Now, before we get into the X's and O's of economic policy, can you tell us just a little bit about the very prestigious Peterson Institute that you head? Wasn't it created as a think tank to promote free market solutions, and has that changed its outlook?
We haven't changed our outlook. The Peterson Institute was originally founded as the Institute for International Economics in 1981, and it was founded in leadership by Pete Peterson, but also by Fred Bergston, who had been a Treasury official in the Carter administration. And the idea was to have a think tank that tried to bring relevant but rigorous ideas, since the U.S. was having a little bit of trouble adapting to being one country among many. It was still the biggest by far, remains so, but after the Carter years, one had to recognize that the international economy mattered to the U.S. and the U.S. role in it mattered to the world. And we've always been in favor of freer markets because we think that helps people purchase more and helps the average citizen, and it's helped people in China and India and Eastern Europe come out of poverty. But we're also the intellectually honest people. We recognize that there's room for regulation, room for redistribution, room for trying to stabilize the business cycle. And as our group has focused on recently, there's a lot of room for saying we went too far with financial market deregulation in the recent years.
Now, you have the unusual distinction of being an American who sat on the board of the British equivalent of the Fed, helping set interest rates and determine monetary policy for the UK. How did that come about? How successful were you, and what did you learn?
It came about to the British people's credit because the British government said for this job, for a lot of top government jobs in the UK, they would be willing to just take open applications from anyone and try to get the best person. It's a little bit disingenuous. I had been a visitor repeatedly at the Bank of England because I was an expert on monetary policy, and I had done some work for Gordon Brown, who was the last Labour Prime Minister in the UK during the crisis, so it wasn't like I was an unknown quantity. But they were open to having a foreign voice on there to help give them perspective. As I told friends at the Fed when I was appointed about this, they were all very nice, and they all laughed uproariously. Can you imagine a foreigner at the Fed? Congress would burn us down, ha, 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 which is kind of a sad commentary, but probably accurate. I learned quite a bit. I think it wasn't that different from what I would have learned serving at the Fed or the ECB, the European Central Bank. But it was a privilege to try to make things better after the worst of the crisis. I fought hard to try to have the Bank of England engage in quantitative easing, engage in buying assets to try to pump up the economy. For a long while, I was being outvoted, but in the end, my committee mates came around and we kept pace with the Fed in doing so.
So a win-win-win all the way around.
Well, I'm not sure. It wasn't a decisive win. The UK economy isn't doing great. There's still a lot there to be done, but it was definitely better than the alternative.
Certainly. Now, you have unparalleled experience in helping a newly unified Germany and then a crisis-stricken Japan and then Great Britain deal with financial crises. What is your sense as to what the proper balance is between the two poles of austerity and stimulus?
It's a difficult matter, but for the kinds of countries we're talking about, which includes even more so the U.S., you've got big countries with their own currencies without real risk of major inflation and very secure property rights. There's a lot more room to balance the austerity off against stimulus than for, say, a Greece or an Argentina, and then you should take advantage of that. That means I was supportive of the stimulus that the Obama administration did at the start of its first term. I actually was in the camp along with then CEA Chair Christina Romer and people like Paul Krugman. I would have liked a bigger stimulus. But at the same time, part of making sure you have the ability to stimulate when you need it is you got to pay off your debts to some degree when times are good. And so I'm not horrified by the fact that the federal government is tightening a bit right now. It's probably not exactly ideal, but it's not a terrible thing either, as I'm hopeful we're having a decent recovery to start.
Mm-hmm. Now, this debate of austerity versus stimulus has been going on now for about a century. Isn't the evidence very clear as to the positive effects of Keynesian economics, that stimulus stops a panic and leads to growth more so than severe spending cuts?
Absolutely. I think the evidence is very clear. The only reason you wouldn't do it is, as I said, if you're a very small country you either have set in a fixed exchange rate regime, so you've got less flexibility, or you've got such credibility problems about paying your debts that money will leave the country, again, in Argentina, Greece. If you're not one of those, Keynesian short-run dynamics are exactly as you said. You have a multiplier of greater than one. You got to try to make use of it. You're not crowding out private investment when there's a panic. If anything, you're crowding it in. Now, again, there are limits to this, but when you've got a recession, you should be stimulating your way out of it.
We're speaking with Adam Posen, president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, our leading independent think tank on economics and globalization. Austerity in the form of massive spending cuts apparently can make a short-term dent in a country's debt ratio. But let's talk about the consequences for the average working man or woman. What are those?
Oh, it can be terrible. I mean, austerity, by the way, doesn't necessarily make a dent in debt. I mean, that's what we're seeing in the UK. If you time it wrong and you do it in the wrong way, too aggressively, it doesn't even achieve what it's supposed to, which is reduce the debt. But leaving that aside, it is always the most vulnerable who are most hit in a recession. So in the U.S., traditionally, it was African-American males who suffered the most in a recession. And that's broadened now in this worst recession to all kinds of young people. And so that's the place you start. But then in addition, when you compound that by austerity, usually if you're doing spending cuts, then you're also affecting the very programs that people who are poor or people who are weaker off in the economy are dependent on. And then you're cutting jobs in the public sector as well, and those are not necessarily the best paid jobs, and they're the jobs with some of the biggest positive impact on other people. So, austerity is a lose-lose. I mean, right now in Ireland, they've been undergoing a significant austerity program, really harsh for the last 4 or 5 years. And there's clear evidence that it's totally regressive. It hurts people.
Mm-hmm. Now, conservatives seem to say that balancing budgets and eliminating debt is a moral issue. Where do you stand on that proposition?
I find that very odd, because you can equally argue that punishing spendthrift lenders for issuing bad debt is a moral issue, and therefore you should restructure the debt and force the banks to take losses. In addition, what's a morality play for one person isn't necessarily a morality play for those innocent people who are caught up in it. And you just can't treat a whole economy that way. It's not like you're punishing one bad boy or one bad girl for misbehaving. You've got got a systemic problem, and the harms can be very disproportionate to whatever supposed waste was on the other side. If you want to play a morality play, go after individuals using the legal system, but not with macro policy.
Mm-hmm. Now, as the U.S. seems to careen from crisis to crisis, how confident are you that America won't wind up like Greece, Spain, or Portugal?
I'm quite confident. I think, again, it may be luck, it may be historical accident. I'm not going to claim moral virtue, but the U.S. just starts off in a fundamentally better position. We have less debt. We have more capability to carry and pay off debt. We have a brighter growth path ahead of us. We have an independent monetary policy. We're not required to stay tied to the euro or something to keep things together. And even in the short term, I think we're going to have a decent, not great by historical standards, but decent economic recovery in the next year and into 2014. So I don't see that happening at all. I mean, there would still be costs if we never got our healthcare system fixed. But, of course, the healthcare problems, as President Obama started to address, are problems of both the private sector and the public sector. It's not an entitlements issue. So, I mean, there are things the U.S. has to address. We also have to address a lot of problems in our education system. We're not perfect, but in terms of these issues of austerity versus stimulus, of potential crashes, the U.S. is in a very safe position. There's no way we become Greece or Portugal.
With some of those that you just mentioned, the healthcare system and others, are we headed in the right direction?
I'd like to think so, but I'm not entirely sure. I mean, there's no question that Obamacare, by extending the healthcare franchise, was the right thing to do and was progress. There are a number of other things, though, in terms of entitlements under the guise of reform that are pretty regressive and may not be necessary. There's a lot that should be done in our tax code that would be both a win for long-term debt sustainability and for justice, like playing games with the carried interest exemption and changing the benefits to debt and mortgages. There's a lot else out there. Healthcare, I fear it's still very much up for play, and the politics of that are so complicated. But the economics are pretty straightforward, that the U.S. gets a very bad return on its healthcare dollar, and a lot of that has to do with the role of private insurance companies, and we should be changing that.
Okay. Adam Posen is president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, the world's leading independent think tank on economics and globalization. Adam, thank you so much for your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to having you back again soon.
Thanks for having me, really.
Indeed. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Professor Molly Michelmore has written about the history of the income tax. With only a month left before taxes are due, she says everyone ought to be happy to be paying them, once they understand what they get in return. That's coming up in just a moment. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
It's a sign that the economy is healing, exclaims a happy headline. It signals that things are getting back to normal, says a delighted market analyst. And the New York Times heralded it as a golden age. The it they're hailing is the Tao, that mythical and mystical force said by faithful Taoists to be the way, the provider of good fortune, often by magical means. It's the Dow Jones Industrial Average, and this holy measure of corporate stock prices is now smiling warmly on its acolytes. On March 5th, the Dow Jones Average reached a new high, regaining every dime of the $11 trillion that Wall Street investors had lost in the 2007 crash. Worker productivity is zooming, corporate profits are soaring, wealth is flowing like a mighty river, Wall Street is buoyant, all praise the Dow. Unless, of course, your wealth is dependent not on stock prices, but on wages. In that case, You're among the majority of Americans who are concerned about the Doug Jones average. Forget all the buzz about a golden age. Doug, Darcy, Dewana, and all the other Joneses can't even afford to eat at the Golden Arches, for they're still mired in the great job depression that Wall Street's crash caused. Washington rushed to rescue the financial elites, but the Joneses are still getting stiffed by the very elites Washington continues to coddle. United Technologies is typical. The profits of this manufacturing giant have never been higher, and it continues to be blessed with lucrative government contracts. Grand, but how are its workers doing? Only 4 days after its stock prices reached a record high in February, United Tech's honchos announced the firing of 3,000 workers, on top of the 4,000 they fired last year. This is Jim Hightower saying the continued separation of the few from the rest of us is revolting in both meanings of that word.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. How did Irving Berlin and Donald Duck figure in the history of the income tax? Historian Molly Michelmore explains that income taxes were once seen as good for farmers, working people, and small businesses. But some Hollywood hoopla was needed to get people to support increased taxes to pay for World War II. And joining us today on americasdemocrats.org, Molly Michelmore is an associate professor of history at Washington and Lee University, where she teaches and does research on 20th century American politics and the relationship between fiscal policy, the politics of taxing and spending, and post-New Deal liberalism. Molly Michelmore, thanks so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
Thanks very much for having me, Jim.
Now, this year is the 100th anniversary of the income tax. You recently wrote an article called Why the Income Tax is Worth Celebrating. How so?
Well, I think that Americans, as a rule, get a lot more from the government, from their local government, from their state government, from their federal government, than we think that we do. And, of course, for the federal government, for some state governments, the income tax is how they pay for all of that stuff that we get. The roads that we drive on, the schools that we send our kids to, the plows that shovel snow, right? All of this stuff comes from the government, and the income tax is one of the ways that we pay for all of these things that we want and we demand from the government. And so I think that alone is probably worth celebrating.
Well, how did something that most Americans now consider odious become popular enough to be ratified by Congress and 2/3 of the states and become enshrined in the Constitution?
What's sort of weird about the federal income tax, at least looking at it from our current political perspective, is that it was actually brought to us, at least initially, by popular demand. It was ordinary farmers, consumers, small businessmen and women that demanded a federal income tax in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And it was this popular demand that ultimately pushed first the Democratic Party and then the Republican Party to endorse a federal income tax. The nation was undergoing profound economic, social, and political changes at the end of the 19th century. Perhaps most importantly, it was going from an agricultural and rural nation to a industrial and urban one. And some people did very well in this transition. Robber barons like Andrew Carnegie or Rockefeller or Vanderbilt did really well. But other groups, industrial workers and farmers, were doing less well. And what made this worse for them was that the way that governments raised money, either through consumption taxes or through tariff policy or through property taxes, either hit the poorest people hardest or didn't do much to tap the new fortunes of the incredibly rich. And so the income tax, the federal income tax, was seen as a way of balancing the scales between the industrial elite, these people that are reaping huge fortunes at the end of the 19th century, and everybody else. And so that's why it's so popular, at least in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
We're speaking with Molly Michelmore, Associate Professor of History at Washington and Lee University. Now, originally, and for a long time after it became part of the Constitution, the income tax was aimed solely at the very rich and was popular among both Democrats and Republicans. When did the income tax start applying to more people?
That actually wasn't until the Second World War, until about 1943. The year before, in 1942, Congress, at the behest of President Franklin Roosevelt, had passed a law known as the Revenue Act of 1942, which had the effect of transforming the federal income tax from what you might think of as a class tax, that is to say, something that was paid only by the very wealthy, to more of a mass tax, something that members of the middle and even working classes would have to pay. So to give you some examples about what this meant in terms of numbers, in 1939, 3.9 million people paid federal income taxes. By 1945, that number was 42.6 million people. In 1939, again, tax collections were $2.2 billion. By 1945, that figure had risen to $35.1 billion. By the end of the war, by 1945, 90% of Americans had to file a return with the IRS, and about 60% of the labor force actually owed some taxes to the federal government. So this is a massive expansion, a massive transformation of the federal income tax, of the size of the federal government, and it required a great deal of work on the part of the federal government, the Treasury Department, and the Roosevelt administration to sell this new mass income tax to the American people. And so they used all of the weapons at their disposal, and this included the new mass media of the 1940s. So they commissioned, for example, Irving to write a song which was later recorded by Danny Kaye and distributed to radio stations across the country called "I Paid My Income Tax Today." They commissioned Walt Disney to make a short, or rather two short films featuring Donald Duck paying his income tax, his taxes to beat the Axis. So this is a massive transformation that brought the majority of Americans for the first time into the federal income tax system and perhaps into direct contact with the federal government itself.
Yeah, but Donald Duck made a lot of money.
Donald Duck did make a lot of money. One of the interesting things that you learn from the first of those shorts is that he is an actor. That is his profession. So you see him filling out his 1040, claiming Huey, Dewey, and Louie as his dependents, and then putting down as his profession actor. I'm not sure why that means he has to dress as a sailor, but that's what Donald Duck officially does.
That's funny. Now, you remind us that the first form, 1040, originally numbered only 3 pages with but 1 page of instructions. Are things just out of control today to the point where even a smart person has to hire somebody else to do their taxes?
Well, I think one of the things that the complexity of the tax code should remind us of is that we've asked the Internal Revenue Code, the tax code, to do a lot more than just raise money, to do a lot more than just collect taxes. The Internal Revenue Code has become a way to stimulate investment, to incentivize home ownership, to provide workers with retirement and health security, to help parents pay for child care. And it may be that the complexity of the code, its apparent impenetrability, like you said, the fact that even a smart person either has to hire somebody or pay a tax preparer or, a website some amount of money to do their taxes, that this impenetrability means that most people don't know what they're paying in taxes, don't know what they're getting back, don't know why they're paying taxes, simply don't understand where all of that money is going and what it's going towards and what it's going for.
Again, we're speaking with Molly Michelmore, Associate Professor of History at Washington Lee University. Should the tax system, Molly, be used as an incentive for achieving desired policy goals, such as home ownership or reduction in carbon-based energy production, that sort of thing?
Well, I'm a historian and not an economist, and so I don't feel comfortable making those kinds of policy recommendations. But what I can tell you is that most public finance experts have agreed that using the tax code is not a particularly efficient way of achieving desired policy ends, that generally speaking, direct spending programs are a more efficient, more direct way of achieving these desired policy ends. And policymakers have a lot more control over these direct spending programs, can better control their distribution as well as their growth. That said, direct spending programs are a lot more difficult, particularly in our current deficit, budget-conscious political context. These direct spending programs are a lot more difficult to get on the books in the first place. So it may be that the tax code, while not perfect, offers the most politically feasible route to achieving certain policy ends, whether that be increasing home ownership, providing retirement security, subsidizing low wages even, which is what the Earned Income Tax Credit does. And it was actually expanded during the Clinton years as a way of replacing, in a way, the direct spending programs, aid to families with dependent children in particular, for the very poor.
All right, so what do you think would be a perfect or at least an equitable tax system? What would that look like?
Well, again, I'm not an economist, but it seems to me that a good tax system should reflect taxpayers' ability to pay. And this has long been the goal of the architects of America's tax systems, that people should pay basically what they can pay. It should also, I think, or the tax code should also be reasonably easy for everybody to understand. And so the complexity of our current tax code may at least be in part responsible for the unpopularity of our current tax system. I think also there are a number of ways that people are thinking about making the tax code more accessible, perhaps giving taxpayers a receipt that shows exactly where each of their tax dollars are going, towards defense, towards income security programs, towards foreign aid, because I think most Americans would be surprised at where their money is going and where most of their tax dollars are being spent.
I've often made that contention. If you really knew what you were paying for, you might not object to it quite as much.
Yes, and where you were spending the most, and what you were spending that on.
Yeah, okay. Molly Michelmore is an associate professor of history at Washington Lee University, where she teaches and does research on 20th century American politics and the relationship between fiscal policy, the politics of taxing and spending, and post-New Deal liberalism. Professor, as always, we appreciate your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org. Look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you, Molly. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Bill Press and his guest, Father Tom Reese, on the chances of an American becoming Pope.
All eyes on Rome these days. Benedict XVI is already in retirement. Now is this period of transition in between. And to check out on the preparations for the next conclave to elect the new Pope, a good friend of ours, Father Thomas Reese, joins us from Rome. He is an analyst for the National Catholic Reporter and author of the book Inside the Vatican, The Politics and Organization of the Catholic Church. He knows what's going on better than anybody. Father Reese, buongiorno.
Buongiorno.
So, do we know yet when the new conclave is going to start? Or the conclave
well, we
will
don't
start?
know yet. We may find out today. They have to start by the 15th of March, but they could start earlier.
Why by the 15th? Is there a
Well, that's
Vatican
just
rulers?
the rules that are in the Constitution that regulates conclaves.
So they could start any time they wanted now, correct?
The best rumor is that they may start Sunday or Monday.
What's holding them up?
Well, some of the cardinals from outside of Rome would just like to have more time to get to know each other, to share coffee breaks, dinner, lunch, conversation. What's the hurry? This is the most important thing that these cardinals will ever do. So they want to have the time before they go into the conclave to talk about it, so that when they do get there, they'll have an easier decision.
Now, what are they doing, and how are they using this time? Are they meeting? Are they having auditions? For new pope, or
no?
Is there a campaign going on?
There's no campaigning, no bumper stickers. In fact, if a cardinal campaigned to become pope, that would be considered a disqualification. It would show that he was too arrogant, too proud by putting himself forward. Well, it's got to be your friends that push you.
Pardon me. I did hear that, or read somewhere, that they're having meetings and the cardinals are allowed to speak, but for no more than 5 minutes?
Well, that's right. Of course, they have about 115 cardinals. So each one, if they wanted to talk an hour, they'd go on forever. So they've limited it to 5 minutes, but I don't think that's very strictly enforced.
But those are kind of auditions, aren't they? For the job.
Well, certainly the cardinals get up and want to express their views about the needs of the church, what the new pope ought to do, maybe even qualifications of a pope. And if someone gives an impressive speech, that could be helpful.
Sure.
If he goes on too long and bores them, that's the end of it.
Right. What language, by the way? Is there a common language?
Well, they have, of course, all sorts of languages in the in the room, but they have simultaneous translations. But I would say most of the addresses are given in Italian or English. English tends to be everybody's first or second language. But not Latin, huh? No, not Latin. Very few bishops would understand it.
Well, whatever happened
in fact, the Vatican? The Pope read off his resignation in Latin, and people were looking around, what's he saying?
Now, I understand you can't tell us too much about what's happening in this in these informal meetings, because there is a gag order, isn't there? And are they abiding by the gag order?
Well, the Americans are. They were actually holding press conferences and told absolutely nothing to us. But the Italian cardinals and the curial cardinals tend to leak information to their favorite journalists. So by the next day, most of whatever happened in the conclave is reported in the Italian press.
Oh, I see. So there are some leaks getting out there now.
Oh, absolutely. This place leaks like a sieve.
In the American press this morning, at least on the Drudge Report, the buzz is that the cardinal from the Philippines has impressed everybody, that we may have our first Asian cardinal. This is a guy who apparently very charismatic. He's a TV preacher. He is on Facebook. He has done a lot of work with the poor. What do you hear about him? Can you tell us, is he a favorite?
Well, I think he's a long shot because he's so young. I mean, by that I mean he's in his early 50s.
Oh, my.
That's young for a cardinal.
Boy, yeah.
The average age of the cardinals is about 72. So it's much more likely that they'll look for somebody in their late 60s, early 70s. Could it be somebody from outside of Europe? Oh, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of talk about someone from Africa where the church is doing very well. On the other hand, other people say, well, the church is doing fine in Africa. Leave it alone. We need somebody who can solve the problems of the church in Europe and North America and South America.
And what about a North American cardinal?
Well, that
I
is
mean,
a real
Pope.
long shot.
Pope, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I think that's a real long shot because, traditionally the church has not wanted to give the papacy to whoever is the superpower, and so chances of an American pope are slim. Plus, you have the problem that a lot of people in the third world would think that if an American was elected, that the CIA fixed the election or Wall Street bought the election.
Right.
And we don't need that.
Yeah, it may even be true. Who knows? Father Thomas Reese is on the line with us from Rome, an analyst covering this conclave for the National Catholic Reporter, and he's also the author of the book Inside the Vatican, the Politics and Organization of the Catholic Church, which we are seeing play out day by day now in Rome. So, Father, I have to ask you, but speaking about North American cardinals, there is a controversy, and I, as a Catholic and as a Californian, as somebody from Los Angeles, very up to date on the controversy surrounding Cardinal Roger Mahony. A lot of people saying that because of recent documents showing his role in covering up the sexual abuse on the part of some priest in his under him, that he should not be allowed to vote in this conclave. But he will vote, won't he?
Yes. Actually, under the rules, the College of Cardinals cannot ban anybody from entering. I mean, even if you had a cardinal who was excommunicated, committed murder, poisoned the Pope, or whatever, they would still have the right to enter the conclave.
Whoa.
So now he could voluntarily decide not to attend, as the cardinal from Scotland has.
Yeah.
But no one can stop him from entering the conclave.
Have you had a chance to see Cardinal Mahony or talk to him, or have any of the reporters asked him?
Well, he has not been talking to the English-speaking press. He did have an interview with one of the Italian newspapers, but he has not made himself available.
And so his intention is to be there and to vote come hell or high water, I guess. Father Thomas Reese, it's good to have you on the scene over there. Thank you so much for taking time out to join us today. And we'll be checking in with you before we see the white smoke.
Good to be with you, Bill.
All right. Thanks, Father Thomas Reese. Arrivederci, Roma. Can't resist saying it. Analyst for the National Catholic Reporter, all eyes on Rome.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Adam Posen, Molly Michelmore, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us, support the show, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org